Now I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Kaitlin is the Southwest Regional Pollinator Conservation Specialist for Xerces, and she has been since 2020. She works to create climate resilient connected pollinator habitat in the Southwest region and collaborates with public and private land managers in New Mexico and the desert Southwest. She promotes pollinator-friendly practices for landscaping, gardening, and open space restoration. She holds a master's degree in environmental science and policy from Northern Arizona University, where she studied aquatic invertebrate diversity. She's also worked in ecological science in Michigan, Virginia, and Massachusetts. And she's going to speak to us tonight on native plants and native pollinators, mutualism, and more. Kaitlin.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, guys. Sounds good. So yeah, I've been here all day seeing all the cool work you guys are doing at the greenhouse, and I got a tour of the bee campus at the UNM Taos campus, and yeah, I've done most of my work in Santa Fe for the past 4 years, and I'm like, I get a reason to go up to Taos and talk to plant nerds. I can't wait. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. So as Mary said, I am Kaitlin Hasse. I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I like to move around, so I'm trying to avoid jumping over in front of the slide, so bear with me. So just to give you guys an introduction to the nonprofit that I work for, the Xerces Society is an international organization dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. We have staff in regional offices throughout the United States, and we've been in the Southwest just since I've been here, since 2020. But we have our headquarters in Portland, Oregon. We work really extensively in the Central Valley of California and in the Midwest, working with farmers there. And yeah, we're growing at quite a rapid rate. When I started, we were about 50 people. Now we're 100. So it's really great to see all this funding and interest in conserving invertebrates and other pollinators. And you might be wondering, why are we called Xerces? That's a weird name for an organization. So we are named after this blue butterfly on the left here. This is called the Xerces blue butterfly. It was a species found in the San Francisco Bay Area, and with the destruction of that habitat, the development of the dunes and everything, this is the first invertebrate we know of to have gone extinct in North America due to colonization. So in naming ourselves after the Xerces blue butterfly, we're honoring that species and dedicating our work to doing science-based research and restoration to prevent the extinction and loss of other invertebrate species. So that is our little homage to invertebrate of the past. And we do this work through a few different programs. So we have a Pollinators and Agricultural Biodiversity program. I'm on the pollinator team, and we do a lot of work with farmers to create habitat on farms to improve the functioning ecosystems of farms, having living farms that aren't extremely reliant on herbicides and pesticides, and bring native pollinators and native beneficial insects to control pest populations back into those landscapes. And we have an endangered species program that works on assessing pollinators and other invertebrates that are in decline, so things like monarch butterflies, bumblebees, and then lots of other things like freshwater mussels. So we've got that program that works more on kind of the policy side and research side. We have a pesticides program that works to find out how we can reduce risk to invertebrates from pesticide use, how we can reduce pesticide use completely. So that's a really important program that supports all of our work. And then we have an urban conservation program that supports outreach and supports our Bee City, Bee Campus USA program. So we are growing and expanding Part of our outreach, urban conservation, is working on podcasts. So we have a podcast called Bug Banter right now. So if you want to check that out, that's pretty fun. And we've got a crazy big YouTube channel with recorded talks like this. So great to have you guys recording this so other people can see. And before I dive into my talk, I'll just do acknowledgements really quickly. We are a member-supported nonprofit, so thanks to any members here. If anyone's a member of Xerces, thank you. And Carol Petrie Foundation funds a lot of our work in the Southwest and a lot of our pesticide work too. So thanks to all of those people that keep Xerces running. So why is there a nonprofit dedicated entirely to invertebrates? So a lot of other wildlife programs, their focus is more on the big, shiny invertebrates, big, charismatic macrofauna, right? You've got bears and deer and birds that are really, obvious and people really relate to them. But invertebrates are extremely critical to the function of our planet. The ecologist E.O. Wilson, he coined this term, the little things that run the world, because they're huge in biomass. Like most species on Earth are invertebrates that we've described, and just in terms of abundance and biomass, they are the biggest group of living things on Earth, and they are important to soil function, water filtration, building the food web. They're just such a critical part of our world. So that is why we exist. And in particular, pollinators, if you're really into plants, they are really important to our plants reproducing. So the vast majority of flowering plants are zoophilous, which means their pollen is moved by animals from flower to flower. For them to reproduce, for their pollen to make it from the female part of a flower, or from a male part of a flower to a female part, to make fertilization happen and set seed and fruit, an animal has to move that pollen. It's too heavy to be blown by the wind, and that's about 85% of all flowering plants. So there's just incredible diversity and reliance on pollinators in our ecosystems. And just to designate all those other different flowering plants, anemophilous are the plants that are pollinated by wind. So those are things like a lot of grasses, some trees. They have really light pollen that blows on the air, and that's what you're allergic to. So lots of people get really upset seeing some animal pollinated plants like chamiza and goldenrod. They're like, oh, that gives me terrible allergies. It's not that. It's something else that's flowering that has that light pollen, because the pollen in chamiza and lots of all these other animal pollinated plants, that pollen's too heavy to just be blowing on the air. Chamiza has kind of an odor to it, and that bothers some people, so maybe you just don't like that, but you shouldn't be allergic to these animal pollinated plants. And then a tiny little subset of our flowering plants are hydrophilous, so they have their pollen float on top of water and meet the flowers on the water surface. So very uncommon, but a pretty cool occurrence if you get to see it in aquatic systems. So let's start at the very beginning. 180 million years ago, the world is covered in gymnosperms. There are no angiosperms. There are no true flowering plants. And so all of those plants were wind pollinated for the most part. They don't have nectar. The flowers aren't showy. Their cones aren't showy. They don't have flowers. So there's, what point in time did animals start going to plants, helping them pollinate and receiving something in return for that? So there's some fossil evidence of gymnosperm pollen on insects like lacewings, scorpion flies, and true flies, where we found those insects in amber, and they have pollen on their bodies. And the theory is So a lot of those wind-pollinated plants, they create these little pollination drops, which are kind of like a little liquid that catches pollen from the air. So something for the pollen to stick to. And when that pollen reaches that occurs in fertilization, but that liquid could be nutritious for insects. So some insects were evolving kind of longer proboscis to reach down in there. And this was probably going on before 180 million years ago, but this is very hard to capture and prove in our very limited fossil record. So that started happening, and from what we understand, pollination sort of evolved twice. So there was this pollination of gymnosperms by these insects with a longer mouthpiece that could reach into the cones. But then, just about 80 million years later, there's a new fossil record that showed the earliest angiosperms were being pollinated by beetles. So beetles have little tiny mouth parts. They don't have anything that can reach deep into a cone or a flower. So there were some plants that started to have really open pollen accessible and those pollination drops accessible. So that was kind of the first really jumping off point for plants to realize, oh, these things that are everywhere will move our pollen for us if we give them something. And that's, of course, their thought process, you know. But through natural selection, this is how pollination kind of got started. And I got this information from this really cool video from PBS Eons. It's a really cool YouTube channel, and they do cool paleontology education videos, but this video is called How Pollination Got Going Twice, and it's a really fun look into that. So back to present day, there are a lot of different insects and animals that pollinate now. With that diversity of plants that have evolved, boomed into angiosperms that are most plants on Earth now. And there are some pollinating animals like birds and bats, vertebrate animals, but the vast majority of animal pollinators are insects. And that includes things that probably immediately come to mind, like bees and butterflies, moths. But then there's some other insects that you don't immediately think of as pollinators, like wasps and beetles and flies. So there's a lot of different insects visiting flowers, but one in particular is very, very good at pollination for a few reasons. And those are the bees. So bees are the most efficient and important pollinators because they're actively collecting and transporting pollen. So most of those other insects and other mammals and birds, they're visiting flowers to get nectar. They need a source of food for their adult flying bodies visiting the flowers, and that's they just get pollen accidentally, incidentally on their legs, fly to the next flower, and happen to move it. Bees are drinking nectar, but they're also collecting pollen on their bodies because they are taking that back to the nest to feed to their babies. So they are vegetarians, they drink nectar in adulthood, and as larvae, their protein source comes from pollen of flowers. So they are packing it on their bodies. They've got really hairy legs, hairy abdomens. They have all of these adaptations to help them collect that pollen and take it back to the nest. And they also exhibit flower constancy, which means that they, once they know their way around one species of flower, they will continue to visit that same species and not go to different ones. So you're actually getting movement of pollen from the same species to another instead of to a plant that it won't fertilize. And then they forage in an area around a nest. So it's all female bees that are collecting pollen and taking it back to the nest to feed their kids. And because they're in one area around a nest, they are visiting all of the flowers that are available in that area that they will forage from. So they really improve seed set, whereas Other insects will be more on the move and just visiting things that are easily accessible, but bees they're gonna get everything they can find. And so when people think of bees, you usually think of a honeybee, right? You think of a queen with a hive and workers in a nest making honey, and that's really rare in the bee world. That is a very, very small subset of bees. So the European honeybee is what we typically think of. These are social bees with a caste system. They have the queen and the workers and are creating this large hive of thousands of individuals. And that makes them pretty different. Most bees are solitary, actually. And then the other thing that makes them different is that they are perennial. So one hive can live for multiple years. Most bees live on an annual basis. And then they are really a livestock species. We manage their hives, move them around for crop pollination, particularly in major industrial ag areas like California, the Midwest. So they're used intensively in our agriculture systems, but they're introduced from Europe. So our native plants really haven't evolved with them and don't rely on them for pollination. It's really our food systems where we rely on them. So just keep in mind, honeybees are an introduced species, more of a livestock species. They're great for making honey and wax and supporting our agriculture system. But really, what Xerces focuses on is our native bees, which are incredibly diverse. We have 3,600 species of bees in the US, in the lower US, and the vast majority of them are solitary. So not remove the picture of the queen and the workers, that is just a very small subset of bees. So most bees, a female mates with a male, and she will find a nest, dig a nest typically in the soil, create a nest in cavities and logs and plant stems, and she is the only one collecting pollen and taking that back to the nest and raising those kids. And most of our native bees are only flying for about 6 to 8 weeks during their lifespan. So most bees, we have different species that are alive at different seasons in the year, and they're usually, they're working so hard to make sure that next generation is able to come back the next year. So those female bees are really, really incredible animals. And you can see another bee you might be familiar with are bumblebees, bombus. So the bumblebees, that's about 50% of they're 50 species, so just a tiny sliver of our native bee species. And they have a little bit more similar life history to honeybees in that they have a queen and a hive, but it's only hundreds of individuals at the most, and they live on an annual cycle. So if you have a honeybee colony in one place one year, you probably won't have it there the next year because it will be a totally new queen hibernating elsewhere and then looking for a place to nest the next year. So yeah, so much diversity in bees. You can see they're in all these different families. We've got giant carpenter bees to tiny little perdita bees. These tiny ones there's a few different tiny genera of bees, but this is a perdita, a fairy bee, and I've seen a ton if you see this little hover around Chamiza in the Taos area, it's usually just a ton of little fairy bees that are specialized on Chamiza. So really cool diversity of bees. And New Mexico is extra special because bees really diversify in arid environments. So most taxa, most plants, most insects, birds, you'll find the most species in tropical areas. But bees don't follow that trend. They are most diverse in really hot, dry areas like the desert Southwest. So we have over 1,000 species of bees in New Mexico, which is over a quarter of our species. And they're yeah, we don't quite know why they diversify so well in the desert. It might be because it's dry and they have less disease to worry about. They might have to create more niches and specialize in different ways because of our tough drought and different ecosystems the desert develops. But yeah, and one really cool research by Olivia Carroll, who's talked here before, they found over 660 species just in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. So that is, you know, there's probably more than 1,000 bees in New Mexico, if that's the case for just one national monument in Utah. But yeah, insects are hard to study. So that is why we don't have a lot of information about them. But that diversity looks really interesting depending on how you see these different bees living their lives. So one thing I like to point out is that some bees are generalist and some are specialists. Some are very picky about what pollen they forage from and feed their kids. And some are will just take any pollen available on the landscape to take back to the nest. So those are things like bumblebees. Honeybees are generalists. They're active from spring to fall, so they can't be picky. They gotta take back whatever pollen is available on the landscape. So the fun science word for that jargon is polylectic. They will collect pollen from many different plant families. Specialist will only collect pollen from one type of either plant family or plant genus. So the ones that collect from one plant family are oligolectic, and from only one genus is monolectic. So we have really a lot, almost half of our species, bee species in New Mexico, are specialists, that they only collect pollen from a certain plant family or plant genus. So that is really important to think about when we're thinking about plant conservation. Does this have specialist bee pollinators? And of course, for pollinator conservation, if we're thinking about how do we support the most diversity of bees, you gotta include those plant families and genera that support specialists. So just a little example of some pollen specialist bees in New Mexico. We've got Cryptantha here. That's a pretty big one. Just, you know, kind of a very nondescript little mountain plant, but feeds a lot of bees. Opuntia and Cylindropuntia, those are huge, feeds lots and lots of bees. If you've ever paid attention to cactus blossoms in an area with a lot of cactus bees, you will just see them going insane in there. And then another Southwest plant, squash. Squash have developed a relationship with specialist bees. We've got a couple different genera of bees that only visit squash flowers. And you can see them early in the morning in there, and the males will sleep inside the flower typically. So if you peek in there in the middle of the day, you can usually see a male squash bee sleeping in there. And we have globe mallows, Sphaerecia. There's lots of things that specialize on mallows, Malvaceae. The Menzelias, that one's really cool. They've got a lot of little fairy bees that are on those. Willow should be blooming soon, so that will be fun to watch. And sunflowers, Helianthus, and then everything in Asteraceae has lots and lots of specialists. And things like primrose are Enotheras. So lots and lots of bee diversity and specialization to consider. Yes?
My apricot trees are just full of little bees. What kind were they?
Okay, so the question was that her apricot tree is full of little bees. That's hard to answer without more description, but I'm assuming right now there are a lot of Anthophora out on the landscape. They're digger bees. Do they move really fast? And yeah, I might have to look, but there's basically little sections of bees for each season. So the early spring season bees are typically a lot of mason bees, like blue orchard mason bees, and then our anthophora are typically out, but those might be big. We can look later. Okay, I'm gonna jump to our next group of pollinating insects, the wasp. So usually you're not thinking about wasps as pollinators. They're mostly predators and parasites. So usually they are eating other insects, but the adults sometimes need some carbohydrates, and they visit flowers and drink nectar. And here's just a few different families of wasp you could see visiting flowers, and they are in the same order as bees, Hymenoptera. So bees, wasp, and ants are all in the same order. But the difference between wasp and bees is that wasp are omnivores, whereas the bees are vegetarians. They've evolved to just eat pollen and nectar for the most part, and wasp are feeding insects and meat and other things to their kids. So the wasp you have visiting your picnics, they're just trying to feed their family. So that's what they're up to. Then we have pollinating flies. So lots of different flies are pollinators. Those are in the order Diptera. And a lot of these are also parasites, similar to the wasp, in that the bee flies and the tachinid flies, they lay their eggs in the nest of mostly other bees. And those eggs hatch and eat those bees and eat the pollen that mom left for those bees. So, and then we have some bees or flies that mimic the look of bees. So here's a mimic of a bumblebee, of a syrphid fly that has evolved to have a little protection in that you might get stung if you touch me, but I'm not actually a bumblebee. Then we have pollinating beetles, lots of different families there. Those are the first insects to evolve really to be the major first pollinator of angiosperms. Those are in Coleoptera. And this includes lots of things, beetles, families that have kind of specialized on visiting flowers. We have flower beetles, soldier beetles, lots of diversity. And typically, the higher up in elevation you go, if you go to more alpine environments, the bees kind of drop off and you see that more replaced with beetles and flies. So that's a fun thing to observe in New Mexico and pollination ecoregions here. And then, of course, the butterflies and moths. This is the order Lepidoptera. Butterflies are pretty diverse in New Mexico. We have over 350 species here. But moths, we just don't give enough attention to, and they're so understudied. And typically, we don't know how many there are, but typically you can take the number of butterfly species in an area and multiply it by 8, and that's how many moths you have. So probably over 2,000, 3,000 moth species in New Mexico. And things like miller moths, the beloved miller moth, they are really important to pollination along elevation gradients as they migrate into our homes and towns. Hawk moths, the Sphingidae, the ones that look like hummingbirds, those hawk moths, those are really, really important pollinators. They're hairy, they visit lots and lots of flowers, so they're a really important moth. And then some tiger moths, like these police car moths you'll see on lots of flowers up at higher elevation. But one interesting thing about moths is that butterflies, almost all butterflies are visiting flowers to drink nectar. Some are just drinking tree sap and don't like flowers, like mourning cloaks don't typically visit flowers. But moths, you have a big group of them that have a proboscis and will drink nectar from flowers. And then you have a big group that don't even have mouth parts or a digestive system as an adult. They have done all of their eating as caterpillars, and then their only purpose as adults is to breed and make more caterpillars. So you see those big, giant silk moths, the really big ones, they don't eat. They're just being fueled off of all the food they ate as caterpillars. So not all moths are pollinators, but most butterflies are, and lots of pollination is done at night by moths. So moths are really kind of an underlooked, understudied group of that plant and insect interaction. So we know who the pollinators are now. So how have plants convinced all these insects to move their pollen? Insects aren't doing this altruistically. They aren't helping plants fertilize their seeds. So flowers offer things like food. That's the big one. They offer nectar, sugary, carbohydrate-rich nectar that fuels adult flight and movement and reproduction. And then pollen is the major protein source that bees are eating, typically the bee larvae. Some beetles and yeah, mostly those two are eating pollen. And then they offer oils too. So a lot of bees will use floral oils to use in their nest. A lot of times they have antimicrobial properties to keep parasites and disease, viruses out of the nest. So really another important resource they're getting. It's their medicine and their food. And then to attract those pollinators, they can have scents, either really pleasant or really putrid, whatever is really attractive to the pollinator they need. And then they have probably our favorite part about flowers are the visual cues, how showy they are, how much color they have, the shapes and the sizes can all be effective at indicating to pollinators or advertising, we have food here. So that is really, I think, why a lot of us are into wildflowers and into native plants, is these beautiful visual cues that plants have evolved to attract pollinators. So we have really showy, big flowers that are easy to see. We have some that are really kind of nondescript, and the plant doesn't put as much energy into making them big and showy, but things like this sumac, it's one of the earliest blooming things, and there's nothing else to compete with, so they don't need to make big showy flowers. And some colors, like there's the theory of pollination syndromes of like plants that are, or flowers that are white and really smelly attract flies and moths, and we've kind of realized that's not quite accurate. But the red flowers that are really tubular, those are pretty well correlated with attracting things like hummingbirds. Most bees can't see red, so hummingbirds are usually the main, hummingbirds and moths are usually the main pollinators of those red tubular flowers. And from a distance, that showy color, size can really help pollinators locate flowers. But then to show the pollinator where to find the nectar and where to run against that pollen and move it, a lot of plants have evolved these nectar guides where it's kind of like a flashing arrow of neon showing pollinators where to go. And sometimes we can't see those. We don't have the same vision as bees. So in UV light, you can really see some nectar guides from different plants. And then shape and the location of nectar and pollen really determines which pollinators are able to access it. So things like this cow parsnip have really open, easy access flowers. So you see things like lots of beetles and flies that don't have a long proboscis or tongue to reach. So you see lots of flies and beetles on things like that. And then things like Monarda that have more tubular flowers and harder to reach nectaries, those are more visited by critters with longer tongues or proboscis. And here's just an example of the diversity of bee tongue length. So if you have a really short tongue, you're kind of limited to what species have really, easy accessible nectaries. And then maybe you're in Anthophora here and you have a ridiculously long tongue. Right now, I've seen a lot of them visiting things like Golden Currant in Santa Fe right now. They can actually reach that nectary. So lots of adaptation here, evolution here, and how to reach the resources provided by flowers. And then another way you can kind of evolve into a spot to select pollinators is when you're blooming, and that's on a daily scale, like desert 4 o'clock. Maybe you open for later active pollinators like moths, and then also by season. So maybe you're blooming early in the season when maybe there's not as many pollinators around, but there's not as many plants blooming at that same time. So it's really just that balance of competition and what is available on the landscape for when you can bloom and what's your best pollinator in that landscape. So those are really the big core foundational things of how plants have evolved to be accessible to different pollinators. And I'll have a couple examples here of really interesting special ways plants and our native pollinators have evolved. So there's this thing called buzz pollination. How many of you guys know about buzz pollination? A few? Okay, so buzz pollination is really cool where plants have evolved anthers that don't have pollen that is easily accessible. It's like in these little tubes with a tiny little opening at the end here. And you can't just get the pollen out just any old way by collecting it. You have to vibrate those anthers. And you can do this with like a tuning fork. You can do it with an electric toothbrush. They do that in greenhouses for things like most plants that have these kind of anthers are things in Solanaceae, Ericaceae, Primulaceae, and Orobanchaceae, orchids, and mostly nightshades. And the bees that can vibrate those anthers are things like bumblebees and a few other native bee species. So those plants really rely on those native bees to be pollinated. And things like honeybees aren't able to do that. And so things like our chilies, our tomatoes, a lot of them can self-pollinate, but that self-pollination, that yield is increased by a lot when native pollinators are visiting those flowers. So really important, keep an eye out on those nightshades and see if you can see a bumblebee attach and vibrate. But I have a video and I don't think I can get sound to work, but I could mimic it. I won't do that. I won't do that for the radio. But let me start it. Oh, shoot. Here we go. So this is elephant's head and the Orobanchaceae. Who knows the genus of this?
Pedicularis.
Oh yeah, that's right, thank you. So here's a little bumblebee visiting one in a high montane meadow. Let me play. And they are flying around, buzzing. As she lands on that flower, you can see her you can kind of see the vibration. And then I kind of slow it down here and you can see the pollen jumping out of the trunk there. So I'll just play that one more time. But yeah, if this had sound, you could hear the buzzing really increase as she's attached to that flower and vibrating it and having that pollen spill out. So yeah, pretty cool instance of native pollinators and their specialization and evolution with native plants. And then there are really, really exclusive relationships like the yucca and the yucca moth. So yuccas, everything in the genus yucca is pollinated only by a couple genera of moth. So these yucca moths are so weird. They don't have mouth parts, so I was mentioning some moths don't feed as adults at all. So they're not visiting flowers to drink nectar. They lay their eggs in yucca flowers, and the caterpillars eat the seeds of yucca. So that is why they rely on yuccas for their growth. And then for the yucca plants, they don't make nectar, Their flowers are really showy and do have a nice scent that attracts the yucca moth, but they don't make nectar and they make very little pollen. And in some weird universe that we happen to be in, the yucca moths have evolved to gather that pollen in these little mouth parts that don't attach to a digestive system and fly to another yucca and like intentionally place it on a yucca flower, on a yucca pistil. So it's very strange that this has happened in evolution, and it's such an iconic New Mexico plant. It's a really, really cool pollination story for New Mexico. So keep an eye out when you are looking at yucca flowers this year. You'll see this little tiny white moth, and that's what they're doing. And if they lay too many eggs in a flower, the yucca will abort that flower. And there's cheater yucca moths that don't move pollen. It's a whole crazy system. I'll try not to get too involved in that. And it isn't perfect, right? So some flowers offer nectar, but some pollinators can't access it. So they work around and do nectar robbing, which is where they chew through the flower to get to nectar and bypass the pollen. So there's no pollen movement happening from this feeding from nectar. So there's all kinds of weird things going on in this evolution. It's not this perfect altruistic bees help flowers move pollen and bees drink nectar from flowers. It's a little more cutthroat. And then one other really cool pollination system I always love to mention are these, not pollen grains, but it's called pollinia that some plants have evolved. So you'll see this in milkweeds and in some orchids, but they're these really hardened masses of pollen grains that are extremely sticky. And so particularly milkweed makes really great nectar that's really attractive to a lot of pollinators. They get these pollen grains stuck on them that no one can eat. They're not really useful for a lot of pollinators. But those pollen grains, once they are slipped into this perfect little part of the flower on a milkweed, that is their preferred evolved way of pollination. But sometimes insects will land here and they aren't strong enough to pull away from the sticky pollen grains, and you'll find dead insects just hanging out on milkweed plants because they've been quicksand there basically. So yeah, not okay, I should probably start moving a little faster. But I just kind of want to give like a run through of some of the really important plant groups to pollinators in New Mexico. I'll go through all of these, but not all flowering plants have the same value to pollinators. And there are several groups of plants that are just really especially attractive. And if you want to observe a lot of pollinators, if you want to attract a lot of pollinators, here's some groups of plants to think about planting. Asteraceae, the best family in the West, right? So we've got so much diversity in Asteraceae, from annuals to perennials. Most are extremely attractive to pollinators because they have all those florets that produce pollen and nectar all individually in one place. And there's lots of different species that bloom at different times. And yeah, just my favorite color palettes in New Mexico are the purple little tansy asters in the fall with things like chamiza and other yellow asters, that beautiful complementary color palette that's so important in fall for late active pollinators. And then sunflowers, if you can only plant one pollinator plant sunflowers. That's a major one. So supports in the Western US, 296 species of bees are specialists on the family Asteraceae. So a lot of pollinators to think about there. The next biggest important family is Fabaceae, the legumes. This, again, pretty diverse, supports lots of specialists things like locoweed, lupine. Further south, it's more acacia and locust. Those kinds of things are really important to a lot of specialist bees and host plants for a lot of specialist butterfly and moth species. Starting early in the season, early blooming mustards are a really important group, feed a lot of pollinator or butterfly and moth caterpillars, and that kind of first source of pollen and nectar in the spring. Then we have the shrubs and also fruit trees in spring, things like sumac and berberis or mahonia, also really great, Shepherdea. Those are really important early blooming resources when those flowering resources are typically scarce. And then, I can't stop talking about Asteraceae, so here's thistles, and plugging the Native Plant Society's thistle guide is really important because we have a lot of invasive native thistles that we want to control because they're impacting native plant populations, but we've got lots of great native thistles that are super critical to pollinators. And then we have cacti I mentioned. So these are supporting lots of cactus specialist bees. So you can see this female bee here. She is just packing all of that pollen onto her abdomen. You can see her legs like really pushing it down to collect that pollen. Then we have beard tongues, your penstemons, really important to bumblebees in particular and other specialists. And milkweeds, of course, feed our monarch caterpillars, and as I mentioned, a really great nectar source and attracts beneficial insects too. You'll see lots of predatory wasps and ladybugs and other predators are attracted by milkweed. Menzelia, one of my favorites. You'll see tiny specialist fairy bees all the way up to bigger bumblebees visiting this, and just a really hardy desert, loves disturbed areas plant. The vervains, this is really good for butterflies and moths with their longer proboscis and are often longer blooming perennials, so those are great. Globe mallows, love Spirelsia. You can always find bees on it, and it is, when you have a lot of specialization on one type of plant, it's usually because that plant is really abundant and does well in our climate, and that's the case with Spirelsia. Buckwheats, Polyginaceae, very important to specialist bees, and a lot of different butterfly and moth species use it as a host plant. Bee plants, Cleomaceae, just a really great, more generalist plant. It doesn't have a lot of specialist bees, but it feeds lots of butterflies, lots of generalist bees. So I want to take a step back and think about why it's important to consider what we need to do to conserve native plants and how that native pollinators impacts that conservation. So you've probably heard pollinators are declining in a lot of different ways. And this is due to habitat loss, so we're losing the food they need, the places they nest, all of those resources. Pesticide use is a major one in a lot of different ways, from big industrial ag use to backyard urban use to spraying on BLM lands for grasshoppers, which you all might know about. So things like that. Disease and non-native species is another issue. And then climate change, of course, is huge in the Southwest. And this impacts things like pollinator networks. So this is what plants are pollinated by different species of pollinators. And so if we lose any species in this network, we're going to really shift this dynamic of which insects are visiting which plants and which plants are producing seed. And this can be impacted by the loss of species, but also the addition of species. So if you put an invasive plant species in the network that is more attractive to pollinators than the native species, that can really create an imbalance. And then with climate change, the phenology mismatch of how early or late plants are blooming and when they're available versus when those insects are emerging from their nest and hibernation. So this is causing shifts in elevation, particularly here in the Southwest. Plants are typically moving up in elevation. Are those pollinators following them? And then shifts in time. And then you can have situations where you have shifts in time and in space. So that can really cause big fluctuations in how these systems work. But we can do some things to address these risks by creating habitat, reducing pesticide use, reducing risk from managed pollinator species, and by building diversity into our habitat to adapt with climate change. Climate change, that's a whole nother talk and a global issue, but for now, we can think about diversity and really use that as our way to at least address it here. And so when you want to build habitat and address that main risk of habitat loss, it's really thinking about food, a diversity of flowers that provide nectar and pollen, as well as host plants for those caterpillars that feed on the vegetative parts of plants, and that those flowers and of nectar are available from early spring until late fall. Then shelter, places for those pollinators to nest and overwinter. And I've got a really great guide if you want to grab one of those, our nesting and overwintering habitat guide. And then protection from pesticides and understanding where those come in, because sometimes nursery plants might be contaminated. Sometimes if your tree is dying and your pest control company says, oh, this is fine, it's usually not fine. So just keep in mind that there's ways pesticides can sneak into your garden, even if you're not actively spraying them. And if you want to learn more, you can go to Xerces.org. We've got so many resources. I have publications here you can take home. We have books you can, hopefully the library has them. If not, I'll try to get them to them soon. You can download all of the publications here on our website and look at all kinds of guidelines and reports. We have more talks on our YouTube channel. You can follow us on social media. And with that, I'll stop and take any questions. Yes.
We have a very diverse home, native flowers, fruit trees, vegetable gardens, blooming, pumpkin squash. How much are the small LED nocturnal lights a problem for pollination?
Oh, great question. So we got a question on a really great yard habitat with lots of native plants and fruit trees and things to feed pollinators. But we have small LED lights, right? Did I?
Right.
Okay.
Sometimes. Is it a problem for what plants?
Yes.
Tell us.
Yes. So light pollution or artificial light at night is a really big issue on a multitude of levels. As there's some guidance on how to reduce that light pollution as an individual, but really the biggest polluters are, more municipalities, commercial places. But light, just if you want to know how it can impact anything, it impacts everything. Everything has evolved for millennia without light at night. We've had this wonderful dark sky for everything to evolve with. So everything from plants to soil microbes to insects to birds to us are impacted by light at night. On this scale of like small little solar lights or LED lights, there's a couple factors that can impact that. So how bright it is, what color it is, how long it's on. So really the main guidance is the light necessary? Determine yes or no. Is the light on only when it needs to be on? Is it a motion light? Is it set on a timer? That can really help reduce the impact. And then we have yeah, color temperature, how shielded it is, those other kinds of, how to reduce it so it's not glowing, contributing to sky glow. But yeah, there's lots of great resources if you want to get a little more into the nitty gritty. Darksky.org has a lot of really helpful resources, and New Mexico is starting to really take some interest in preserving our night sky for observatories for lots of reasons. So,
What
yeah.
colors are best for backyard pathways?
Okay, what colors are best for backyard pathways? I would say kind of more amber lights, reddish lights, maybe yellow lights. Yellow lights, it depends. Every species of animal can have different color lights can have an adverse effect on their behavior. So if you live where fireflies live, yellow is not the best choice. But typically, we don't have a ton of fireflies here. So unless you're in a really wet area where there are fireflies, yellow's not the best choice because they flash yellow or green. So those are the two colors that really impact them. But we have some guidance documents if you want to pull them up. Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question about bird baths.
Okay.
Do you have any tips on like how to not have the bees and the insects drowning in your bird bath?
Great question. So what do we do about bird baths and all the critters that are drowning themselves in our bird baths and other watering features? Really just having any kind of sloping thing that will reach the surface of the water. So hopefully they'll stop spinning around at some point and hit a surface where they can, if you put pebbles in, but typically something that kind of slopes up and has like a little bit more of a longer place for them to land, that is typically ideal. But most of our native bees, they don't even need water. Honeybees need water. Native bees get their water from nectar typically, and that's what they've evolved to rely on. And but butterflies, they don't typically need open water, but just watering your plants, they like to puddle by putting their proboscis down on the wet soil and taking up nutrients there. So yeah, most pollinators don't need like an actual open source of water, but of course birds love it too. So yeah, having some sort of surface where they can land.
Thank you.
I'll go for you.
I've read a general article about honeybees, corporate honeybees on rooftops in urban areas being, there are too many of them because they're out competing and native. Is that a problem?
Yeah, so the question is, corporations promoting rooftop honeybees in urban areas. Oh, it's a little bit greenwashy. So yeah, so honeybees, there are more honeybees on Earth now than there ever have been because we are keeping so many of them, and we create more queens and colonies every year to support the agricultural industry, the hobby beekeeping industry. So there's so many honeybees on Earth, and a lot of places are getting oversaturated with honeybees, particularly urban areas. So yeah, it is, if you want to do bee conservation, if you want to conserve pollinators, creating habitat is really the best thing you can do. Reducing pesticide use is what you should do. If you want to keep honeybees to make honey as an educational thing, a homesteady thing, that should be its purpose. But if you want to save the bees, keeping honeybees isn't saving the bees, really. You need to create food for them. Yes?
Is there a way to design the landscape that would discourage honeybees? If you're trying to create it for native bees, native pollinators, and you don't want the honeybees to come in and outcompete, are there ways to structure it?
That is a great question. So the question is, if you're making habitat and is there anything you can do to dissuade honeybees from using that habitat so only native pollinators can use it? I don't know. Honeybees are generalists, so they are happy to use just about anything. The further away from private lands you get, usually honeybees can fly about 2 to 3 miles on a foraging trip. So the further away you can go from, like, up high in the mountains, you typically don't see honeybees because it's too far for them. So kind of location based on where humans are is really, but to dissuade them, I don't know, you got me stumped. Oh no, that's great. Any other questions over there?
Well, I
Yeah.
had one that it's probably been answered, which is, what about the use of ag vinegar?
Ag vinegar and things like neem oil, these more organic options. So those are still pesticides, right? They're organic, but they're typically less long-lived, typically, and they're a little more, you have to be a little bit more mindful versus the really broad spectrum big sprays that are used from other pesticides. So yes, if, our, motto is to try to use IPM and a three-legged stool of control of pest before relying on pesticides. So are there cultural practices in place to prevent that pest? Are the plants stressed? Do they need more water? Do they need to be moved to a place that it may be more shady or more sunny? Just finding out why that plant is stressed and susceptible to a particular pest. That can be, one route. And then physical removal, spraying things with water is another great option. I think one of the biggest challenges home gardeners face are squash bugs, and usually planting a trap crop of a different squash can help reduce the damage they do to the squash that you want. So yeah, it can be tough. There's just a lot of different ways to manage how you make an environment less inviting for pests and more robust for your plants, so your plants are healthy and can actively fight off pests. And then having habitat for the natural enemies is really important too. So you can invite all kinds of wasp and assassin bugs and ladybugs and all those critters into your habitat, but you're going to have a few pests because they need something to eat, right? So to feed those, you don't want to totally eliminate pests because they're part of our ecosystem. They're feeding the predators in our habitats typically. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but thanks. Yes, Mary.
The typical advice in the fall is to leave your perennials in place
Mm-hmm.
so that bees can nest in these hollow stems. And yet I've heard that here, since we have more native bees who nest in the ground, that really isn't permission.
So I highly recommend leaving as much plant material as possible because there's something using it. We might have maybe a bigger proportion of ground nesting bees in other parts of the country, but we definitely still have stem nesting bees, and we have lots of other insects using the structure of old perennial plant material. So there's, maybe not a lot of stem nesting going on. I think there would be a lot here in Taos because typically you see more stem nesting bees in riparian areas. So since you have some Marias here, I think you'll have a bigger presence of stem nesting bees. But yeah, I think really just as long as you're keeping some perennial plant material in the space, it doesn't have to be like right where it was growing, but just leaving some do not disturb areas that are a bit messy and just really have a lot of plant structure. That's just a great place for all of those insects to spend the winter and find cover during windy spring. So yeah, great question. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I just-
No, no,
Okay.
you're good.
Does anyone use Mexican hat, like any
Oh.
pollinators?
Yes, so the question is, do any pollinators use Mexican hat? And it is by far a favorite. I see so many different bee species on it. You will see lots and lots of critters on it. So yeah, that Rotibita columnifera is definitely a favorite by lots of bees. Cool. Well, thank you guys. Yeah, thank you.